This episode on Geopolitics with Alex is really pretty much about you. In other words, the questions that you have posed in our YouTube series and the chat, which of course I encourage all of you to follow. Now, if you look at the series overall, we've had over 2 million views, and really remember that we are a fairly small and new school of transnational governance here in Florence, so we're very honored and in many ways baffled by the positive reception that we've gotten from you. If you add on to that we have over 10,000 questions or comments that have come in over the past few months, it feels very overwhelming, and I should tell you that our team, which basically consists of Roland, who does our communications, Andre, who does our camera work and video work, and myself, we're overwhelmed. We're trying to rake through all the different questions and find different themes that you suggest. And the nice thing with the conversation that we're having online is that it's very constructive. You know how social media sometimes can be. I mean, we sort of get a little bit too abrupt, and well, my favorite media is Twitter and 280 characters, and people get a little bit, how would I say, binary. But our conversation has been very good, and I've learned a lot from it. And today I'll try to learn through your questions, and I hope they're helpful. Of course, I'm only going to have to, or only going to be able to scrape the surface, but I'll give it a try. And we've bunched them up a little bit. And again, we're talking over 10,000 comments, so you know that we can't have everything here. But the first one is on a question that seems to be re-emerging on how we can define victory and defeat. So we've had questions, for instance, from Zoran, from Joe, from Andre, from Pertti, from Rainut, and many others. And they're pretty much about, okay, can you define what a Russian defeat is, or can you define what success is? Or, okay, Alex, what if NATO does not defeat Russia? Or what is the definition of victory for Ukraine? How far do you think we can go? And then there's sort of this hypothetical that, well, what about if Russia wins? What do we do then? So this is really about defining victory and defeat. And it's obviously an extremely complicated question. Now, if you look at the really big perspective, I do agree with Zelensky here that this is really about victory or defeat for an authoritarian regime which is breaking international law, international rules and norms, or democracy which is trying to defend itself. So that's a sort of the big scene here. So if Russia wins, it's a victory for autocracy and basically rogue state, big power politics, and invasion and imperialism. And if Ukraine wins, it's a victory for the free world. Now, how do we then define it? You will have seen that President Zelensky has put down a 10-point peace settlement, if you will. Russia has talked about, a Minsk III agreement. But I think at the end of the day, it's very simple. Basically, if Ukraine wins, it pushes back Russia to the position that it was in before 2014. So that means the current regions that Russia has tried to annex in the east and the south, and then it also means the Crimean Peninsula. This victory is possible only if Ukraine is provided with arms and armaments and support. And after that, you can start peace negotiations. Now, then we come to the question that, okay, what if this doesn't happen? And to be very honest with you, I don't have an answer. You see, I come from a country that was attacked by the Soviet Union in 1939 and then had a 105-day winter war, and then later on a war of continuation which ended up in what we call a reluctant peace with Stalin, where we lost 10% of our territory, namely Karelia. And, I can't sit here and say that a fair peace agreement would be one in which Ukraine gives up the Crimean Peninsula. It's a possible scenario, but it's not a comfortable scenario, not for Ukraine and actually not for the West either. So the answer here is, how do we define victory and defeat? Well, it is in the eye of the beholder, but when it comes to pure territory, I would argue that getting the lines to 2014 is a victory for Ukraine. Getting the lines to pre-24th of February is basically an even call, and anything below that is a loss to Ukraine. The second batch of questions that you have posed are all linked to NATO, and especially Finnish and Swedish NATO membership. And you will have seen that in the series on understanding the war, we had a specific episode dealing with Finland, Sweden, NATO, and actually Russia. But one of the questions coming from Padani, and then linked also to a question from James, Padani asked, why didn't the government of Finland organize a referendum on NATO membership? They promised that they would do it, but they didn't. Well, there were two reasons for this. One was the urgency of the situation, and I think it's fair to say that NATO membership popularity in Finland was verified by opinion polls, which went from actually 50 against 20 in favor to 50 in favor, then later to over 80% of the population in favor of NATO membership. So at that stage, I think both the government and the president decided that it was not necessary to organize a referendum to verify the public mood or the public opinion. The second one was actually a security issue, because had we organized a referendum, it would have given an opportunity for disinformation and hybrid warfare and intimidation coming from Russia. So the government, the president, did not want to open that side and increase the security risk for the country by organizing a referendum during the months of the war. So these were the reasons that they didn't do it. The second question on NATO is that, can NATO really work when the country driving the bus is the US and has interests that do not line up with European interests? Well, I kind of disagree with the undertone of that question. I think we do have common interests with the United States and the European Union. They are as much about values and democracy and protecting and defending the free world as they are about big power competition with Russia or actually with China. Now, there was of course a lot of talk about the US pivoting to the Pacific and to China after the Cold War ended, and that has happened, but I do think that Europe is back in the game. Does this then mean that, American security will guarantee Europe for eternity? No, I don't think so. So I do think that we'll probably end up getting a more European NATO, especially now that we have two very important countries, Sweden and Finland, joining NATO up in the northeastern corner of Europe and NATO. So I do think that there'll be a more European NATO, but I do not think that our interests with the US are that conflicting. Then thirdly, there's been a question about sort of a balance moving towards the East. So are we seeing, the question coming from Noel is, I wonder if we're now seeing the rise of an Eastern European Union of some kind. So is there a shift towards the East? Well, to a certain extent, yes. And the reason I say this is that it's very linked to the substance. So if you looked at the European Union during the financial crisis, it was very much about the North versus the South, and the West and East being perhaps a little bit more silent. Then during the asylum crisis in 2015, it suddenly became more an issue of the West versus the East, with of course the biggest burden being taken by the South. And then when we came to COVID, suddenly, geographic location didn't matter that much because we understood that we were all in the same boat. Now with the war in Ukraine, and then of course the spillover effects of the energy crisis, we understand that the balance of the European Union, the focus of the European Union is in the East, because Poland is receiving most of the asylum seekers coming from Ukraine. There are energy issues in the eastern part of Europe. There are security issues in the eastern part of Europe. So the focus is there. And then of course you add on to that Putin has ignited a application avalanche from the East to the European Union. So we have applications coming in from Georgia, from Moldova, and from Ukraine. So I do think it's justified to say that the European Union has become a little bit more Eastern. When on top of that, of course, we have a Brexit from 2016 and the exit of the United Kingdom. If there was a weight balance of population, we can see it certainly tilting towards the East. Then there's a question, and thank you a lot for the feedback that I got on the episode where I was talking about the mistakes that I had personally made on Russia. The question here is on the visa regime. So Alexei is asking, could I elaborate a bit more on why visa liberalization was a mistake? And Alexei's argument is that he actually thinks that it's a good thing to make it easier for people from countries like Russia to see other parts of the world. Well, in essence, that was my argument, and I agree with you when you're talking about normal Russians. But of course, with visa liberalization could potentially also come other types of activity. And now that we are in this impasse when Russia is becoming isolated politically, economically, financially, culture, sport, travel, etc., I think the visa ban is a reality. So before we have a Russia which has become a normal Western European power, I think visa liberalization is very difficult. But the basic argument that travel actually enhances your senses and opens your mind and curiosity, I think is the correct one. But I was probably driving it at the wrong time in a wrong place. The next set of questions is about missed opportunities to partner with Russia. So this is very much linked to the question, where did we get it wrong? Siana, among others, Mikael, have asked questions to the effect of where there are windows of opportunity where Russia could have been integrated into Europe ideologically and turned into a trustworthy partner. And I would say yes, there was sort of the decade of unrest in the 1990s with Yeltsin, and I think there were attempts to try to integrate. But as we've talked in previous episodes, usually after a period of unrest in Russia, there's a will to have stability, and that's when Putin comes in. There was a short window of opportunity. Some people disagree with me on this, but the window of opportunity would have been around 9/11. That's basically when Putin, leaned over with a helping hand to fight terrorism. And that was sort of, rejected in one way or another by, the US and George W. Bush, and then to a certain extent by the UK and Tony Blair. But, would that have changed things? I don't know. There was the NATO-Russia Council and an attempt to, integrate Russia into the West. But the problem is that when you have a leader like Putin, who is former KGB and doesn't trust the West and doesn't believe in the same values, he thinks that the West is decadent and unstable, and that he has the winning cards in his hands. I'm not sure it would have happened, and I don't think it would have happened. So my argument here is to say that I think no matter what we would have tried, and a lot of people did try, whether energy dependency or joining the WTO or being in the Council of Europe or the NATO partnership and others, it just didn't work in the end. And I think we should have seen what's coming from Putin's Munich speech in 2007. Of course, then it was a lost cause when Russia attacked Georgia in 2008 and annexed Ukraine in 2014. The next set of questions, and I'll still deal with two, is on China and the U.S. And Nitrovs and Kostas, amongst other, asked the question that aren't there similarities between the situation with China? I sort of say yes and no, but I'm always a little bit reluctant to draw direct parallels. Remember that just economically, China is very different from Russia. It's nowadays 10 times bigger. It's an economy which is not purely dependent on natural resources or fossil fuels as Russia is. It's a much more technologically advanced society than Russia. It also comes from a different, of course, Asian, Chinese culture. But I guess the main question is that, should we decouple with China, as some argue we should have done with Russia? And my answer is no. I don't think we should decouple with Russia, with China. I think that yes, we should be careful. And we should look at path dependencies, etc., etc. We shouldn't be naive about our relationship with China, but I always think that cooperation is better than not cooperating. And to draw then similarities, I'd be very careful about that. China is also obviously a power which has much more patience. It's not in an urgency to go anywhere, whereas Russia was always, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, a power in decline, and that's why they were much more prone to, do knee-jerk reactions as they did, I think, with Ukraine. Then there is this sort of question about Putin. It's come from all kinds of different angles about, should we replace Putin, or then this question that do we think that his behavior is rational? Well, to both of these, the first one is the replacement issue. I think it's quite clear that it's very difficult to get back to normal international relations if Putin were to continue in charge. But it's a kind of a thing that you can't force from the outside. Change has to happen always from the inside. So it has to happen from Russia. And then, of course, there are two avenues there. One avenue is that he's replaced by a hardliner, which continues more of the same. The other one is that he's replaced basically bottom up through a revolution. Whether that will take place or not, I really don't know. So my argument is that the West or the rest of the world can't replace Putin. It has to come from the inside. Final point, do we expect rational behavior? And if so, has the behavior been rational so far? Well, you remember in one of the early episodes on Understanding the War, I talked about this. I think some of the Western media and pundits are wasting time on analyzing, the sort of psychological state or physiological state even of Putin and trying to draw conclusions from that. I think if you want to understand Putin, read about Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. This is really, as I've said earlier, about his legacy. So he's driven by this idea of Ruski Mir, of Greater Russia, going back to the borders of the 1800s and basically having a great Russia based on three things: a common language, a common religion, Orthodox, and then a common leader, which is himself. Of course, he made the strategic mistake of assuming that he would be able to walk into Ukraine, and I don't know whether he was advised poorly or not, that the Ukrainians would somehow embrace Russianness and that the West would once again be helpless in the face of Russian aggression. But of course, this didn't happen. So his behavior is still probably rational from a Russian perspective, but looking at it from a Western perspective, of course, the exact opposite of what he was looking for has happened, which basically means we have a European Ukraine instead of a Russian Ukraine. We have a united Europe instead of a split Europe. We have a rejuvenated transatlantic partnership instead of a dead transatlantic partnership. We have a NATO with a new purpose instead of a dead NATO. And on top of that, we have Finland and Sweden joining NATO. So from his perspective, the behavior might have been rational, but the outcome was certainly something that he didn't expect. So with these words, I want to thank you for the thousands and thousands of comments that you have provided. I'm a bit of a nerd, so I actually roam through them. I get a lot of ideas for different occasions, whether I'm giving a talk here at the School of Transnational Governance or somewhere else around the world, or whether I'm writing something in the book. So please keep the comments coming, and please remember to follow our YouTube channel, our Twitter channels, and our Instagram channels as well. Thank you very much, and see you soon again.
America made its declaration of independence.